the longer we go on without any racing in Formula One, the more seems to be happening behind the scenes. Formula One teams have been discussing serious plans about the next few years of F1, and that's all been going on with recent developments this week as well. So to help me, Glenn Freeman, work out what's going on, I'm joined by Scott Mitchell and Ed Straw. Ed, very recently we heard from Christian Horner that one of the things that could be considered by F1 is pushing the new regulations back even further. They've already been delayed until 2022, but Horner suggested maybe we should go to 2023. It doesn't quite look like we're going to get that, and Scott will explain that for us in a minute, but you feel quite strongly about this, don't you? What do you think they should do?
Well, currently, we're in an extraordinary situation with the COVID-19 pandemic. We don't know how long it's going to be before F1 gets started. We don't know when the revenue will start building up to be paid to the teams next year. And extraordinary situations require extraordinary measures, and it requires a degree of conservatism, of financial retrenchment. These regs will, certainly in the short term, even if they're cheaper to run in the long term, will cost teams money. So to me, it seems compelling to argue that you push that down the road 12 months, ideally so you can work on those new cars in a season where your revenue streams are near as makes no difference back to some kind of normality.
That makes a lot of sense to me as well. When I heard the suggestion, I thought, well, of course, just push it back further and remove the risk to the teams who maybe can't afford these sort of things. But Scott, we know from the discussions that have been going on most recently that this isn't very high on the agenda. So what's going on, and why don't they want to consider pushing it back any further?
Well, the primary objections to delaying the rules comes from Formula One and the FIA, and I guess from the standpoint of these are meant to be these big shiny new rules that help transform the championship into something slightly more entertaining than we've had the last few years with Mercedes dominance. I guess they don't want to postpone them any longer than they feel is necessary. But sort of as Ed's laid out there, this is quite a crazy time, and there's a lot of teams in F1 and F1 itself that will become vulnerable. So there's no good trying to spruce up your championship in a few years' time if there aren't enough teams around to compete in it and make it an actual championship. It's basically got to the point where they're sort of kicking the can down the road, so to speak. There's just more pressing concerns that they feel need to be addressed in the short term. The budget cap, which is meant to come in next year at $175 million is going to be reduced, and we'll get into that in a minute. But there's other issues on the table as well. You've got teams and F1 itself furloughing staff to try and protect employment in the short term and make sure they've got enough money in the long term. So it's basically just not at the top of the priority list at the moment. I understand why it feels like the sort of obvious solution, but there's so much disagreement over what the immediate step should be that this has basically been parked and is being treated as we'll cross that bridge when we come to it.
Okay, so not definitely off the table. Now, you mentioned there that there are disagreements in the discussions that are taking place at the moment, and this is really about finances and potential cost caps. So what's the latest there, and how have we ended up with kind of two sides divided over this?
Well, what the likes of McLaren want to see is this opportunity taken to drastically slash the budget cap. As I said, it's meant to be $175 million, but we understand that all 10 teams are in favour of, or at least open to, it being reduced to $150 million when it's introduced next year. But McLaren want that to go further. They've tabled a $100 million cost cap with a sort of compromise at 125 or 130. But 100 is that sort of magic number where basically you bring the absolute big spenders right down to the lowest level of among the teams. That strikes me as being very optimistic from McLaren's point of view. There's all sorts of reasons why that won't work. So you've basically got this situation that's arisen where some of the teams, McLaren being chief among them, see this as an opportunity to basically address a long-standing issue in Formula One, whereas at the complete other end of the spectrum, you've got Ferrari, which is saying, well, Ferrari, Mercedes, Red Bull, they design and manufacture components that smaller teams then purchase from them. For example, it's not just engines, it's things like the gearbox and the suspension components and stuff like this. So if you put everyone down to a sort of bare minimum cost cap and a universal cap across all of the teams, it would be unfair because the big teams have to spend more of that money designing and building parts that the smaller teams then buy off them, presumably for a much smaller cost than the R&D that goes into them, not to mention the infrastructure that needs to exist to enable that development to take place. This is Ferrari's argument. That don't necessarily speak for Mercedes and Red Bull, but that is why it's basically, okay, if you have a 130 million cost cap or 150 million, there needs to be some leeway either side. So the bigger teams that are building and designing and building more parts then get X amount on top of 150 million, and then the smaller teams get that same amount under 150 million because they're not having to pay for that. So those are the two sort of ends of the spectrum. They're quite far apart. I think there is a sensible compromise in the middle, which, given Mercedes tends to be quite sensible and decent at this sort of thing, Mercedes probably occupies that middle ground. But where McLaren and Ferrari are seems quite far apart at the moment.
Yeah, I think the important thing is that the focus has to be on getting it right for the short to medium term financial situation. It's not about teams gaining a competitive advantage over each other, because that will always be kind of in the DNA of the teams. There'll always be a desire to do that. That needs to be put to one side. And also, it's not really about trying to make this a fix-all for F1's long-term financial problems. It's about bridging across to the point where things get back to normality. So it's very important that these things are correctly framed. And although intuitively you say, yeah, lower the cost cap, the better, it doesn't really work like that. One particularly important thing I think we should add is that if larger teams have to operate to too lower a cost cap, they will be forced into making redundancies they might not otherwise make. Redundancy payments are not included in the cost cap, so they can pay to do those adequately. But for me, it would be reprehensible if F1 takes a course of action that forces teams to lay off people who they wouldn't be laying off, because these are real people, real lives. It would have a serious impact in that regard. So there's the bigger picture that has to be considered here.
I think it's very interesting that in a recent video we were discussing how impressive it was that F1 teams were all pushing in the same direction with how they're trying to handle the wider global crisis we have here. But now we're into discussions that could possibly be to their advantage or disadvantage, and once again they're disagreeing. Now, you talked about when we get back to normality there. Is all of this disruption potentially giving us a chance to fundamentally close the gap between the major manufacturer teams and the smaller independents? You know, could this ultimately be very good for F1, or would that be going too far?
I think F1 has to be very, very careful about those sorts of things. That requires wide, long-term strategic thinking. And in fact, what are currently the 2022 regulations were designed to do that. I don't think you necessarily get a good outcome on that kind of thing if you do them under serious duress. This is about those shorter-term measures to make sure everything works well. And in fact, any changes that can have an impact on challenging F1's financial imbalance, etc., I think needs to be done in slightly different circumstances, which actually is another argument for punting the rules back another 12 months, because then there's enough time perhaps to think about that in a little bit more detail. So no, this is... The people say that a problem is an opportunity, but I think in this situation it's a problem to be solved. The opportunity to rebalance Formula One can be done down the road. We may get a little bit of that out of almost luck, shall we say, but I think number one objective, number two objective, number three objective is make sure the teams and Formula One get through this intact, functioning, so that they've got a future.
Yeah, there's this disagreement over sort of whether competitive opportunism is valid, or whether it's just the smaller teams trying to be sneaky, because this is a rare situation where the big teams, the manufacturers, are actually vulnerable in some way, because they stand to lose as much as the small teams if F1 implodes on itself. But like Ed says there, I think that's tricky, because these rules and the agreement of a budget cap in the first place it was all done with something in mind from the big teams, where they were willing to have that fundamental baked in financial advantage cut back. So I think they have shown a little bit of grace there in being willing to let that happen. It feels like it would be a little bit unfair to take advantage of this situation to completely peg them back. I think you're going to achieve that quite naturally with a few of the measures that are being talked about. If if you pull the budget cap back slightly instead of aggressively, you're still going to fundamentally limit the bigger teams more than the smaller teams. If they're then willing to then have a glide path in place so that the budget cap does come down bit by bit over the next few years in a responsible way, then that's probably going to be achievable as well. Plus, there are all sorts of things that the big spenders in F1, they're investing massively for no reward. For example, the engine divisions, they operate at a loss because the amount of money they have to sell the engines at don't come close to the R&D costs and manufacturing costs of producing those engines. So it's a very, very broad spectrum that we're dealing with in terms of costs in F1. In a shock move, it isn't a one-size-fits-all answer. So I agree with Ed. I think the priority needs to be a sensible set of cost-saving measures that protect all of the teams on the grid, and then that should have a natural consequence of bunching the field up and giving the smaller teams a chance. I think if you then try and sneak a few shots in there, that's where this sort of thing can unravel and that collective goodwill can disappear.
Interesting times ahead then for Formula One. There's going to be a lot more going on here. Just because there's nothing going on track doesn't mean the teams aren't busy behind the scenes, even though we currently are in the middle of the factory shutdown. So lots of stuff for Ed and Scott to keep getting their teeth into. We'll keep you up to date on everything that's going on there at the race. So make sure you like this video, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. In the meantime, stay safe, stay at home, and we'll see you very soon.